October 12, 1944. The truck doors slammed open under the Texas sun. Inside, 43 German women, radio operators, nurses, and clerks sat in rigid silence. Dust filled the air as the soldiers outside barked orders. They had crossed the ocean believing the same thing. Americans were small, lazy, weak. That was what the Reich had told them. But when the canvas was lifted and the light hit their faces, disbelief spread like wildfire. Before them stood a line of guards who looked more like steelworkers than soldiers. Towering men with arms like timber and calm. Unreadable eyes, Greta Schneider, 22, whispered, "Mein Gott. They are giants." A younger girl added shakily, "If one sneezes, we'll all fall down." The guards didn't move, didn't speak. And in that stillness, the impossible happened. The first sound in Camp Huntsville wasn't a scream. It was laughter. The laughter was brief, nervous, the kind that escapes before the body remembers fear. But in that moment, something shifted. Greta stepped off the truck, clutching the single cloth bag that held her entire life. She had served faithfully as a radio operator in occupied France. She had repeated slogans about German superiority, about weak Americans who hid behind machines. She had believed them all, and yet here was Sergeant Mike O'Reilly, a man so tall he had to duck under the truck's frame, his uniform straining against the muscles of a lifetime spent in a Chicago steel mill. His tone was calm, his accent foreign but not cruel. "Welcome to Huntsville," he said. The women exchanged quick glances. They'd been told to expect brutality, mockery, anything but decency. That night, locked in the barracks, Greta stared at the ceiling. "They lied to us," she whispered. Outside, a coyote howled across the Texas plain. Inside, 43 German women lay awake, trying to reconcile everything they'd been told with what they'd just seen. It was the first crack in the wall of lies. Morning brought with it the strangest of scents, warm bread and strong coffee. Not the thin gray broth they'd been fed for months, not the hard, tasteless rations wrapped in despair, but actual breakfast. Greta stood still in the line, staring at the tray in her hands as though it were a hallucination. There was fruit. A single orange sat atop the metal plate like something from a dream. She hesitated. "Eat," whispered Frida beside her, the youngest among them, barely 20. Her voice carried more steel than her thin frame suggested. "If it's poison, at least it's tasty." A few of the women chuckled, quiet, cautious laughter, the kind that doesn't bubble up but instead sneaks out like something forbidden. Still, it was laughter, and for a few seconds it pushed the fear to the edges of the room. The mess hall was oddly bright that morning, sunlight streaming through the barred windows in thick yellow lines. American guards paced along the walls, their boots echoing sharply on the concrete floor. They weren't like the German officers. There was a looseness to them, a casual rhythm in their movements. But their size, almost all of them, looked like they could lift a truck with one hand and swat a person with the other. Sergeant O'Reilly stood near the door, tall and immovable. He had the build of a tree that had grown straight up for 100 years. Private Tommy Wilson, who always seemed to be carrying something, passed by with 2 trays in hand. He had an open face and a polite nod for anyone who dared meet his eye. His smile flickered more than it shone, but it was still a smile. Frida nudged Greta and whispered in German, "That one looks like he arm wrestles God." Lysel snorted, covering her mouth quickly with a napkin. The laughter wanted out. It pushed at the seams. Just then O'Reilly turned their way. The women stiffened instantly, the moment snapping back into fear, but he simply nodded once and turned his gaze away. Later that morning, they were assigned to laundry duty, mundane, repetitive work in a dim side building that still smelled faintly of lye and mildew. But it was warm and it was quiet. For a few hours, they could pretend they were somewhere else. That's when Frida saw him again. O'Reilly, this time ducking to get through a low doorway on the far side of the room. "He must hit his head every time he enters a house," Frida whispered, her voice full of mischief. It was louder than she realized, loud enough that he turned. The room froze. His boots hit the floor with slow, deliberate steps as he walked toward them. The clank of wet laundry stopped. Hearts raced. Greta gripped the edge of the tub until her knuckles turned white. Frida straightened, chin high, eyes braced for the worst. But when O'Reilly reached them, he didn't shout. He didn't grab anyone or call for a superior. Instead, he tilted his head, half smiling. "You know," he said in clear, slightly amused English, "I can tell when someone's talking about me." Even in German, No one breathed. Frida held her ground. "You are—" "Very tall," she replied, each word careful but confident. "We are surprised." Something shifted in his expression. His shoulders relaxed. A smile broke free. "Where I come from, this is normal size," he said, gesturing to himself. "We grow big when we eat too much corn." It was such a strange thing to say. So absurd, so American. There was a beat of silence. Then Frida laughed, a quick, bright sound that escaped her lips before she could stop it. Not a careful laugh. Not a fearful one. A real laugh. And then O'Reilly laughed too. The sound of it was like thunder that didn't scare them. It filled the room with something no one had felt in a long time. Light. After he left, the silence returned, but it was a different kind. A softer one. They finished their work with lighter hands. That night, the barracks felt warmer, even without the stoves running. The women huddled on their bunks, whispering in the dark. "Maybe Americans aren't monsters," Lysel murmured. "No," Frida said with a grin. "Just very large and very strange." Even Greta smiled. She opened her journal beneath the blanket, scribbling quickly with the stub of a pencil. "We laughed with the enemy today," she wrote. "Maybe that is where peace begins." By late November, the Texas wind had turned cooler, carrying the smell of dry grass and wood smoke. The days were quieter now. The women worked in the laundry, in the kitchens, and out in the vegetable garden where frost rimmed the edges of the leaves. The guards no longer barked orders. They simply pointed or used short English words that everyone had learned to understand. Here. Water. Good. The hostility that once hung over Camp Huntsville had thinned into something strange, cautious curiosity. Then, one morning the interpreter announced, "Tomorrow is Thanksgiving." Dozens of puzzled faces turned toward her. The word meant nothing in German. She struggled to explain. "It is how Americans give thanks for life, family, blessings." "Blessings," Greta repeated quietly. The word felt alien in her mouth. She had seen cities burn, friends vanish, brothers die. Blessings belonged to another lifetime. Yet the next afternoon, as they were marched into the open yard, Greta stopped short. Long wooden tables stretched beneath the cottonwoods, draped with white cloths that fluttered in the wind. On them stood platters of food so rich and abundant it looked like a painting. Golden turkeys glistening with butter, bowls of mashed potatoes, bright cranberry sauce, loaves of bread, even steaming pies that smelled of cinnamon and pumpkin. Frida blinked hard. "For prisoners?" The interpreter nodded. "You are guests today." The word sent a ripple through the group, shock, disbelief, maybe even embarrassment. Prisoners did not eat like this. Not during war. The guards took seats nearby, plates filled with the same food. Sergeant O'Reilly lifted his tin cup, voice steady and deep. "To peace someday." For a moment no one moved. Then one woman, Lysel, hesitantly raised her own cup. A few more followed until the gesture spread down the long table. Tin met tin with a faint, uncertain clink. Greta tasted the turkey. It was rich and tender, melting with flavors she hadn't known since her mother's kitchen in Berlin. The pie made her eyes sting. Frida whispered, half laughing, "If this is prison, I fear freedom might disappoint me." Greta smiled faintly. "Perhaps we have been fighting the wrong people." When the meal ended, the guards began clearing plates. Private Wilson emerged, holding a strange brown object shaped like a swollen almond. "Football," he announced proudly. Frida tilted her head. "Why not round?" "It's more fun this way," Wilson said, spinning it in his hand. He threw it in a clean spiral. The women gasped as it cut through the air. "Here, try," he called. Frida caught it awkwardly against her chest, then attempted to throw it back. The ball wobbled end over end and struck a captain squarely in the shoulder. Silence. Then the captain burst out laughing. The tension cracked like glass. Soon half the yard was filled with German women chasing the ball, tripping over their skirts, shrieking as they missed again and again, while the guards cheered them on. Even the interpreter gave up translating the rules. No one cared anymore. By sunset, everyone was breathless and dust-streaked, laughter echoing through the fading light. For the first time since capture, they forgot to be enemies. That night, Greta wrote in her notebook, "Today I saw my enemy eat, laugh, and help me stand when I fell. The world feels larger and kinder than Germany ever told us." Winter came quietly to Texas, though for the German women it arrived with an unfamiliar gentleness. Frost clung to the edges of the barrack windows in delicate white veins, and the dry wind carried the scent of pine from somewhere far beyond the wire fence. Inside the camp, life had begun to settle into rhythm. The women were eating better, laughing more. They had grown used to the routine of chores and the predictability of the guards' orders. Their skin no longer looked pale from fear. Even Sergeant O'Reilly noticed. One morning as he passed the work shed, he stopped and said with half a smile, "You look less like soldiers these days." Greta looked up from where she was mending a torn shirt. "Maybe more like people," she said softly. He nodded, but behind his kind expression something darker was stirring. Rumors were spreading among the guards. Rumors of what the Allied troops were discovering in Europe. A week later, a military truck arrived from Washington. It carried no food, no mail, only heavy metal film canisters stamped confidential documentary footage. The soldiers unloading it looked grim, as if the reels contained not pictures but ghosts. That night, Captain Elizabeth Warren, the camp's commanding officer, ordered every prisoner and available guard to gather in the recreation hall. Rows of wooden benches filled the space. The women whispered nervously, unsure why they'd been called at night. Captain Warren stood in front of the projector screen, her uniform crisp, her face grave. "You will watch this," she said through the interpreter. "These films were taken by our soldiers in Europe. They show what they found. In your homeland." The room fell still, the lights dimmed. The projector clicked in Word and the first image appeared. Grainy, black and white, yet brutally clear. A barbed wire fence. Then faces, sunken, skeletal, eyes too large for their skulls. A field strewn with bodies frozen in unnatural stillness. Piles of shoes, thousands of them. Gasps echoed through the hall. Someone cried out. Another whispered, "Nein, das ist unmöglich." The film kept rolling, carts filled with corpses, soldiers helping survivors too weak to stand. The camera lingered on the faces of children who looked more like shadows than people. By the time the reel stopped, the silence was unbearable. Only the soft hiss of the projector filled the room. When the lights came back on, many women were shaking uncontrollably. Some hid their faces. Others stared blankly ahead as though still trapped inside the images. Frida gripped Greta's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. "This cannot be real," Greta whispered. No one answered. Then a voice came from the back, Sergeant O'Reilly. "It's real," he said quietly, stepping forward. "We didn't want to believe it either. But we saw it. Our boys found it." Greta turned to him, her eyes red and wide. "How could we not know? How could something like this happen under our flag, in our cities, and we not see?" He crouched beside her, lowering his voice. "Because evil doesn't always wear a monster's face. Sometimes it hides behind uniforms, behind the word duty. It tells you not to ask questions, not to think, and good people stop seeing." Greta covered her face with her hands. Around her, sobs rippled through the crowd. Even the guards, hardened soldiers who'd seen death in every form, stood frozen in silence. When Captain Warren finally dismissed them, no one moved. It took minutes before the first woman stood and walked out, her steps slow and unsteady. That night the barracks were filled with quiet weeping. Liesl lay on her bunk whispering, "We thought we were strong." Frida, hollow-eyed, replied, "We were blind." No one laughed for days. The air in the camp grew heavy, haunted by knowledge that could not be unlearned. Even the guards stopped making jokes. Meals were silent, work was mechanical. It was as if the film had stolen sound itself. O'Reilly felt the weight too. He had seen men break on battlefields, but this was different. These women weren't soldiers, they were witnesses to their nation's collapse. He found himself walking the perimeter late at night, wondering what kind of world would rise from the ashes of so much deceit. Then one evening, as he passed by the women's quarters, a sound stopped him cold, a song, soft, trembling at first, then steady. Greta's voice humming an old German lullaby, the same kind mothers sang to children before the war. He stood there for a long time listening. It wasn't joy, it was survival. A fragile act of defiance against despair. The next morning, Greta appeared at his office door, her face pale but her eyes alive again. "Sergeant," she said in halting English, "I want to make a show." He blinked. "A show?" "Yes, comedy, music. Something to help us remember we are still alive." He stared at her. "After what you've seen?" Greta nodded. "Because of what we've seen. He leaned back, studying her. You really think laughter can fix this? She looked him straight in the eye. No, but maybe it can remind us we're still human. For a long moment he said nothing. Then finally he smiled, tired but real. All right, he said. Let's see what you've got. That night the word spread like a spark through the camp. The German women were putting on a show. For the first time in weeks, the sound of life returned to Huntsville. Quiet laughter, distant singing, the faint echo of hammers building a makeshift stage. No one knew yet that this small act, this insistence on finding laughter after horror, would become the turning point not just for Greta, but for everyone in that camp. The camp had changed. Where silence once lived, laughter began creeping back like sunlight through cracks in the walls. For weeks, the German women had moved like shadows, haunted, hollow. Now there was motion again, sound again, purpose again. Greta became the quiet architect of it all. With Captain Warren's cautious permission, she began organizing what the camp would later remember as the show. There were no resources, no instruments, and barely enough paper to write scripts, but somehow, that made it sacred work. Frida, who had once used humor to hide fear, found her calling. She wrote a comedy sketch titled The Giants of Huntsville. It poked fun at the very guards who had once terrified them, the towering American men who now carried buckets, repaired fences, and taught the women strange English phrases. I swear, Frida joked one evening during rehearsal, Sergeant O'Reilly could use me as a toothpick. The room erupted in laughter. Even the most reserved women laughed until they cried, their laughter echoing off the wooden walls like church bells of release. Liesl volunteered to sing. She had a clear, aching voice that turned simple songs into something holy. When she practiced, the guards walking past the barracks would pause and listen through the open windows, wordless but moved. Even Anna Vogel, who hadn't spoken in weeks, found a way to help, sketching posters on scraps of cardboard using burnt charcoal. The posters read, One Night Only, Songs and Laughter by the Ladies of Barracks 3. As February crept in, the women worked tirelessly, mending curtains to use as stage backdrops, turning potato sacks into costumes, painting scenery with leftover soap water and dirt. Their hands were cracked, their supplies pitiful, but the energy was unstoppable. By the time February 14th arrived, the entire camp buzzed with nervous anticipation. Valentine's Day, though meaningless to most of the Germans, had become the chosen night. Love was not the theme, but it was in the air nonetheless. Love for life, for laughter, for the fragile humanity rediscovered inside a prison camp. That evening, the recreation hall glowed like something out of a dream. Rows of oil lamps lined the walls, their flames trembling like living stars. The guards and the prisoners sat shoulder to shoulder, unsure how to behave. The air carried that strange electric stillness before transformation. Greta stood backstage, heart pounding. She glanced at Frida, who gave her a wink and whispered, If they don't laugh, we'll just blame the lighting. Greta stepped onto the stage. Her voice, steady but soft, carried in English across the silent room. When we first came here, she began, we thought these men were monsters. We were wrong. They are giants, but the kind that carry, not crush. A beat of silence, then applause. Genuine, thunderous applause. The guards looked at each other, surprised by their own emotion. Then Frida took the stage. She strutted out with exaggerated stiffness, pretending to duck under invisible doorframes, bumping her head against a non-existent ceiling. Everywhere I go in this camp, she declared in thickly accented English, I find a giant waiting to block my sun. Laughter exploded. She mimed O'Reilly's slow, deliberate walk, his deep voice, his habit of scratching his chin before speaking. And when he laughs, she added, the floor shakes. Earthquake warning, American humor incoming. Even Captain Warren, known for her iron composure, was wiping tears from her eyes. O'Reilly leaned forward in his seat, shaking his head in disbelief, laughter booming through the hall. That woman's gonna get promoted, he muttered. Between acts, Greta moved on and off stage, translating jokes, introducing performances, and managing timing like a professional conductor. Each act carried a little piece of healing. A group of women performed a mock fashion show using laundry sheets and mop handles. Another mimed the chaos of learning English from the guards, mispronouncing words with dramatic flair. Thank you, turning into tank you to roaring laughter from both sides. Then came Liesl's moment. The hall dimmed, and she stepped into the center of the stage, her hands trembling. No props, no instruments, just her voice. She began singing Kein schöner Land, a German folk song about longing for peace and home. The melody floated through the air, gentle and heartbreaking. The guards fell silent, hats removed. O'Reilly found his throat tightening as he recognized the emotion, if not the words. When the final note faded, there was silence, a silence so deep it felt like prayer. Then, as if the entire camp breathed together for the first time, the room erupted in applause. Frida was crying openly now. So were several guards. In that fragile space between laughter and tears, something unspoken passed between them all. For 2 hours there were no uniforms, no enemies, no flags, only people. Human beings trying to forget the cruelty of the world outside the barbed wire. After the show, O'Reilly approached Greta as the others cleaned up. "You did this," he said quietly. "You brought life back to this place." Greta shook her head. "No, Sergeant. We just remembered it was still inside us." He looked around the room at the women laughing, at the guards sharing food, at Captain Warren smiling for the first time in months, and nodded. Later, as the lamps burned low and the camp fell quiet again, O'Reilly turned to Captain Warren and said softly, "They're not prisoners anymore. Not in here." The captain followed his gaze. "No," she agreed. "Not tonight." Outside, the February wind rustled through the cottonwoods, carrying faint echoes of laughter out beyond the wire, into a world still at war, yet a little closer to peace because of what had happened inside that hall. May 1945, the war in Europe was over. Germany had fallen. The Reich that once promised 1,000 years had collapsed in less than 12. The radio crackled with news of surrender, of cities in ruins, of soldiers laying down their arms. For the women of Camp Huntsville, the announcement came like a tremor through the air, too vast, too distant to understand. They had spent so many months behind fences that victory and defeat felt like words from another universe. That morning, the camp loudspeaker hummed to life. Captain Elizabeth Warren's voice carried across the yard, calm but edged with gravity. "All personnel and prisoners report to the recreation hall for a special assembly." The women exchanged nervous glances. Greta wiped her hands on her skirt and joined the line that wound its way through the compound. Frida and Liesel followed, their faces pale. Even O'Reilly, standing at the doorway, looked uneasy. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Captain Warren stood at the front beside Sergeant O'Reilly, holding a folder marked Orders Repatriation Directive, POW Camps, U.S. Sector. When she spoke, her voice was steady but not without compassion. "Ladies, the war in Europe has ended. Victory has been declared. Within the coming weeks, arrangements will be made to return you to Germany." The words fell like stones. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Greta felt something inside her go cold. Return to Germany to what? Her home in Berlin had been bombed months ago. Her brother dead. Her parents missing. She thought of the newsreels, the camps, the bodies, the lies, and her stomach turned. Captain Warren continued, "Transportation will begin June 1st. You will be escorted to the port of Houston, and then transferred by ship to Europe. Upon arrival, you will be processed and released." Silence. Then Greta rose to her feet. Her voice trembled at first, but her resolve did not. "Captain," she said, "what if we do not want to go back?" Every head turned. Even the guards stopped shifting. Warren looked at her carefully. "Miss Schneider," she said gently, "these are official orders. This isn't a decision I can alter." But Greta's eyes did not lower. "Germany is not the home I left," she said. "It is ashes, lies. I learned truth here. Freedom here. Please let us stay." The captain hesitated. Before she could answer, another voice joined in. Frida stood, chin lifted, defiance burning in her eyes. "We have no homes left," she said. "No families. If we return, we go to ghosts." Then, one by one, others rose. Liesel, Anna. 8 in total. 9 women standing shoulder to shoulder, trembling but unbroken. Captain Warren's stern facade cracked slightly. "You understand what you're asking?" she said. "To stay in the country of your captors?" Greta nodded. "We are not captives anymore. We are witnesses. Let us build something good from what was destroyed." The room stayed silent long after the meeting ended. That night, Greta sat at a small desk in O'Reilly's office, a sheet of yellow paper in front of her. The smell of ink and oil filled the air. They began to write the petition. Frida dictated, her accent thick but her words sharp. We, former prisoners of war, request permission to remain in the United States as refugees, having no surviving families or homes to return to. We seek to live in peace and serve the country that showed us mercy. O'Reilly corrected their English gently, his calloused fingers guiding their phrasing. Greta added a final line in her own careful handwriting. We have learned that freedom is not given. It is understood. The document took days to complete. Each woman signed her name in full, their ink-stained signatures symbols of rebirth. O'Reilly sent it through official channels to Washington, knowing the odds were slim. Then they waited. Every day that followed felt heavier than the one before. The guards tried to keep routines normal, morning roll call, kitchen duty, reading sessions, but everyone felt the tension. The women's laughter had returned after months of grief, but now it carried a tremor of fear again. Finally, one humid June afternoon, the telegram arrived. O'Reilly was in the command office when it was delivered, a single sheet stamped with the seal of the U.S. War Department. He read it twice before walking, almost running across the yard to the women's barracks. When he burst through the door, Greta and Frida were sitting by the window, sewing. They jumped to their feet at the sight of his expression. He said only 2 words, "Petition approved." For a moment, no one moved. Then the room erupted. Laughter, tears, shouts in English and German tangled together. Frida grabbed O'Reilly's arm and shook it like a child. "We stay?" she asked, almost not believing. He grinned. "You stay." 9 women had been granted provisional refugee status, the first in Camp Huntsville's history. But joy mixed with sorrow. 34 others would still return home. The trucks were scheduled for departure that same week. On June 20th, the yard filled with noise and dust as the convoy prepared to leave. The women hugged each other tightly, their goodbyes whispered through tears. Frida clung to Private Wilson's hand until the guard called for boarding. "I laughed at you the day I arrived," she said through trembling lips. "Now I laugh because I can," he smiled, eyes wet. "And I'll be laughing when you come back." The trucks rumbled to life, engines growling like thunder. Faces pressed against the barred windows, waving until the camp disappeared in the haze of dust and sunlight. O'Reilly stood by the gate, cap in hand. "Godspeed, girls," he murmured. When the last truck vanished down the dirt road, only silence remained, the kind that follows endings. Greta lingered beside him, watching the horizon fade. "You taught us that strength isn't size," she said softly. "It's mercy," he turned to her. "And you taught me it's never too late to start over." Behind them, the flag above the camp fluttered in the Texas wind, no longer a symbol of victory or defeat, but of the fragile bridge that mercy had built between 2 broken worlds. October 1970. The Texas sky was the same deep gold it had been 25 years earlier. The old camp was gone, replaced by a park with a small stone plaque, site of Camp Huntsville, where enemies became friends. Under a white tent, gray-haired men and women gathered for a reunion. Some had flown from Germany. Others drove from across America. Greta, now a translator for the U.S. State Department, stood near the edge of the crowd, her hair streaked with silver. Then she saw them, Frida and Tommy Wilson, hand in hand, their 4 grown children beside them. And there was O'Reilly, older, slower, but still tall enough to cast a shadow across the crowd. When Frida spotted him, she grinned. "Still taller than forgiveness itself," O'Reilly laughed, the same booming laugh that had once filled the camp laundry. The crowd erupted in applause and tears as they shared memories of that strange, impossible time when laughter had saved them from despair. Greta raised a glass. "To those who showed us that mercy can be stronger than hate." The sun dipped behind the trees, bathing the park in golden light. "They were bigger than we expected," she whispered. "In every way that mattered, fade to black. Sometimes the smallest laugh can end the biggest war."